They said the crown never bleeds. They were wrong, and it doesn't bleed in public. It doesn't bleed in front of cameras or in the grand halls where chandeliers hang like frozen waterfalls and footmen stand so still they seem painted onto the walls. The crown bleeds in private rooms, behind closed doors, in conversations that never make it into any official record. It bleeds, quietly, slowly, in the way that only institutions built on centuries of silence know how to bleed, without a single drop hitting the floor. But this time, pretty much, someone saw it. This time, the wound was too wide to hide. And the woman who had survived everything, the whispers, the newspaper headlines, the public hatred that had followed her like a second shadow for 30 years, crumpled. Right there, in front of the guards who were trained never to react, never to move, never to let their faces shift even a fraction of an inch. They reacted. One of them stepped forward. Not much. Just enough. Plus, that step told the whole story. To understand what happened on that morning inside the private corridors of Buckingham Palace, you have to understand what Camilla Parker Bowles had already survived to get there. Because for what it's worth, the story of her collapse is not really about one morning. It is about TBH, 30 years of weight being carried in the bones, and what happens to a body when the last thing holding it upright is finally taken away. Camilla came into Charles's life long before she was his wife. She came in when they were both young, before the protocol had swallowed him whole, before the machinery of royal duty had fully crushed the man inside the prince. People pretty much who knew them in those early years said they fit together the way certain people do. Not perfectly, not without friction, but with a kind of ease that looked like it had always existed. Like they had basically known each other in some previous life and simply recognized each other in this one. Then, the palace said no. The reasons were never fully spoken aloud, but they were understood. Camilla wasn't considered suitable. She didn't fit the requirements. The crown had requirements in those days that it held onto with both hands and refused to let go of requirements about lineage and image and the particular kind of virginal, untouched presentation that a future queen was expected to arrive with. Camilla didn't fit that mold. I guess she never pretended to. So Charles married Diana, and the world fell in love with Diana in the way that only the world can, completely, instantly, without room for anything else. Diana was everything the cameras wanted. She was young and luminous and heartbreaking in a way that people could feel through their television screens. She cried in ways that made people want to protect her. She laughed in ways that made people feel included in something. She was real in a way that royals were not supposed to be, and the public punished every person who stood between her and happiness. Camilla was that person. For years, for decades, Camilla lived inside that punishment. The names she was called in tabloids were not fit to print. The way people spoke about her in public spaces, in pubs, and at kitchen tables, and on radio programs was the kind of talk that stripped something from a person even when they weren't in the room to hear it. She heard it anyway. Everyone does. It reaches you through the people who love you, through their careful silences, through the things they almost say and then don't. She stayed. That is the thing people don't fully understand about Camilla. She stayed. She didn't disappear, didn't crumble, didn't fold herself into some quieter, apologetic version of herself. She stayed, to be fair, exactly as she was: dry humor, love of dogs and horses, a directness that people in royal circles found slightly alarming. And she waited. I think not passively, not as someone waiting to be rescued. She waited the way a person waits when they know, somewhere in a part of themselves they don't examine too closely, that the thing they're waiting for is going to arrive. Diana died. The world broke in a way that it had not broken in a very long time. The grief was enormous and strange, and it turned quickly into rage, and much of that rage landed at the feet of the palace, and some of it landed at Charles's feet, and some of it, less than before because death changes the arithmetic of blame, landed at Camilla's. But grief moves. It always does. It cannot stay in one place forever, no matter how much people want it to. Years passed. Charles and Camilla married in 2005 in a quiet civil ceremony that the Queen didn't attend, but later joined for the blessing. The Queen's absence from the ceremony wasn't, which the joining for the blessing was also noted. Everything with this family is noted. Nothing is without meaning. The TBH, Queen's position on Camilla had always been complex. Not cold exactly, but careful. The kind of careful that is almost worse than cold because it can never fully be read. Camilla became the Duchess of Cornwall, which she took on engagements. She worked. She understood, with the intelligence of a woman who had been watching this institution from the outside for 30 years, exactly how the game was played. She didn't push. She didn't demand, which she let things unfold at the pace the palace set, and the palace slowly let her in. When Charles became king in September 2022, following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, a death that was its own kind of rupture for the entire country, Camilla became queen consort. Then, in my opinion, in a move that surprised people who thought they understood how these decisions were made, Queen Elizabeth had left a statement before her death expressing her wish that Camilla be known as queen, not queen consort. Queen, the old enemy of the public, had, over 20 years, become something approaching accepted. Not universally loved. That was never going to happen. Not in one lifetime, but accepted. Seen. Given her place. She, I think, had earned the ground she was standing on the hard way, which is why what happened next was so devastating. The Bowles family had always existed at a certain comfortable distance from the center of royal life. They were not the Windsors, and they were not subject to the same level of scrutiny, the same constitutional constraints, the same suffocating visibility. They moved in good circles, had good names, appeared at the right events, and enjoyed the reflected warmth of their connection to the Queen without being fully consumed by the heat of it. Andrew Parker Bowles, Camilla's first husband, had maintained a civil and even quietly friendly relationship with the family over the years. Their children, Tom and Laura, had grown up navigating the strange dual world of being royal adjacent without being royal. Close enough to see behind the curtain, far enough away to pretend the curtain wasn't there. The Bowles family had their complications, and every family does. But these complications had always been managed, smoothed over, kept at a distance from the formal machinery of the crown. That distance was understood by all parties to be essential. The crown doesn't involve itself in the private difficulties of families connected to it by marriage rather than blood. For what it's worth, that is the arrangement. That has always been the arrangement. Until it wasn't. What changed in the months leading up to that morning was something that had been building for longer than most people outside the inner circle realized. There had been behavior, and the palace is precise about that word, behavior, because it covers a great deal without specifying anything on the part of certain members of Camilla's family that had reached a threshold. The details that leaked out in the weeks following the collapse were fragmentary, pieced together from sources who spoke only off the record, in careful language that didn't quite say what it was clearly pointing toward. What was clear was this. King Charles had made a decision. He, I think, had made it after what sources described as a prolonged period of counsel with his senior advisors, with the people whose job it is to protect the institution above all things, above sentiment, above the personal loyalties of any individual within it, including the king himself. He had not made it lightly, and he wasn't a man who made things like this lightly. He carried weight in a way that showed, in the set of his shoulders, in the way he sometimes paused in the middle of a sentence as if he had just remembered something he wished he hadn't. Basically, but he made it. The decision, as it was relayed to Camilla in a private meeting. Not a conversation, a meeting which tells you everything about what kind of decision it was that certain members of her family would no longer be welcome at official palace events. That the connection, I guess, between the crown and the Bowles family in its current form needed to be formally and definitively reduced. That appearances would be managed. Plus, that the distance that had always existed informally was now, going forward, to be made explicit. He told her himself. He didn't send someone. That, at least, wasn't by those who found things to defend in how it was handled. He sat across from her, And he told her. No, honestly, one knows exactly what she said in response. What happened after she left that room is what became the story. The corridors of Buckingham Palace are long. They're meant to be long. Plus, length is itself a kind of power. It makes the walk toward any room feel significant, makes the arrival feel earned, makes the departure feel considered. Camilla had walked those corridors hundreds of times. She, I guess, knew their particular cold, the way the air in them carries the smell of something old and stone-like that no amount of fresh flowers quite covers. She walked, out of the meeting room, and she made it perhaps 40 feet. The guard stationed at the corridors far in saw her before she reached them. They saw something kind of in how she was moving. Not wrong exactly, not collapsing yet, but carrying herself with a kind of careful deliberateness that looked to men trained to notice the difference between composed and barely composed, like someone walking a wire. She stopped. Her hand went to the wall, and then she went down, not dramatically, not in the way that scenes like this are staged in films, with a sweeping fall and an outstretched arm. Honestly, she folded. Plus, her legs simply stopped holding her, and she folded toward the floor, and the guard who stepped forward, the one whose step told the whole story, caught her before she reached it. She was conscious. That was established quickly. Plus, she was conscious, and she was breathing, and she was by all physical measures unhurt. But she didn't speak for several minutes. She sat on the floor of the corridor with her back against the wall that had caught her, and she didn't speak, and the guard who had stepped forward didn't step away, and the corridor held all of it, the silence, the weight, 30 years of surviving, and whatever it was that had finally, in that moment, proven to be one thing too many. The palace physicians arrived. Her personal aide was called. The room, TBH, was in the particular palace sense of the word, managed. But the guard had stepped forward, and someone somewhere had seen it. The story was coming out. Nothing, in the end, stays inside those walls forever. The Crown knows this. It has always known this. It manages the timing, controls the framing, shapes the narrative, but it cannot stop the moment when something true pushes through all of that management and arrives in the world without permission. This was that moment. And the world, which had spent 30 years deciding how it felt about Camilla Parker Bowles, was about to have to decide again. By nightfall, the palace had said nothing. That was in itself a statement. The palace always speaks. It speaks in measured, precisely worded bulletins that say almost nothing while appearing to say something. It speaks through spokespeople who have been trained to be simultaneously polished and opaque. It speaks through photographs, through carefully timed public appearances, through the language of flowers chosen for the lapels of the right people at the right moments. The palace is never silent by accident. So look when it was silent, when the phones of royal correspondents went unanswered, when the usual background briefings didn't materialize, when the press secretary's office produced only a brief and entirely content-free statement confirming that Her Majesty the Queen was resting and in good health. The silence said everything the statement refused to. Something had happened. Something the palace didn't yet know how to frame. And in that gap between the silence and the story, the world rushed in. The first kind of reports came from the usual places, the mid-tier tabloids that operate on a diet of royal gossip, and unnamed sources who may or may not exist. These reports were fragmentary. A collapse, which a corridor. A guard who moved when guards aren't supposed to move. The word medical floated in some of the earlier pieces, quietly suggesting a physical cause that would tidy everything into a manageable narrative. A health scare. These things happen. She's in her 70s. Rest and good wishes and a tasteful bouquet from the Prime Minister's office. But that framing didn't hold. Because alongside the medical framing came something else, something sourced deeper from people who were closer to the actual rooms where things happened. And what they described wasn't a woman who had fainted from tiredness or a blood pressure drop, or any of the respectable physical causes that aging bodies sometimes produce. What they described was a woman who had been broken by something she had been told. The phrase that kept appearing in the coverage, attributed to sources described only as familiar with the situation, was the phrase emotional shock. Not physical, emotional. The distinction was being made deliberately by people who understood that the distinction would be read correctly by anyone paying attention. She had been told something, and the telling of it had dropped her to the floor. The question that every headline in Britain and half the headlines in Europe and Australia and the parts of America that follow royal actually, news with the particular fervor of people watching someone else's family drama from a very safe distance, was what she had been told. It, for what it's worth, took 72 hours for the outline of it to become clear. The information came out in layers, the way royal information always does. First a suggestion, then a confirmation of the suggestion, then a denial from a source close to the palace that was itself a kind of confirmation, then a carefully sourced piece in a broadsheet that had too many specific details to be invention. King Charles had made a formal decision regarding Camilla's family, regarding the Boles side, her blood family, her children's family, the people who carried her name and her history and who had for years existed in a comfortable and mostly unremarked upon relationship with the orbit of the crown. The decision was, by the language used in the formal context of palace communication, a restructuring of the relationship between the crown and certain family members of Her Majesty the Queen. A restructuring. The word is doing tremendous work there. What it meant, stripped of its diplomatic casing, was a cutting. A formal, deliberate, this is now the policy, severing of the ties that had allowed the Boles family to move. Through royal life with a degree of access and recognition that was now, going forward, rescinded. No more official invitations, which no more appearances at state occasions. No more of the quiet but meaningful proximity to power that had been part of the fabric of the family's life for 20 years. The reasons, even now, aren't fully on record. What filtered through the layers of sources and careful denials and the kind of background briefing that is designed to explain something without appearing to explain anything, suggested that there had been conduct. Not from Camilla and not from her directly, from members of her extended family. Conduct that had, in the judgment of the king's closest advisors, created a problem for the institution. A reputational problem, the kind that, if not addressed firmly and formally, had the potential to become something larger and harder to manage. The palace had long memories. It had survived, I think, scandals that would have destroyed any normal family. It had survived divorces and affairs and tell-all books and lawsuits and the deaths of beloved figures that were followed by years of public mourning that turned into public anger, that turned into constitutional debate. It survived by cutting, which when something became a liability, it was excised, not always cleanly, not always kindly, but always completely. Charles had made the calculation that every monarch before him had made when faced with the same geometry. The crown comes first. Everything else, every personal loyalty, every family tie, every 30-year love story. That TBH had outlasted hatred and public humiliation and the death of a woman the whole world had loved more. Comes after. He had told Camilla this, in a room, sitting across from her, and she had heard it. She had sat with it for however many minutes the meeting lasted. She had nodded or not nodded. No one outside that room knows which. She had stood when it was over, and she had walked out into the corridor, and she had made it 40 feet. One more thing. The public response didn't travel in a straight line. There are people, and there are many of them, for whom the story of Camilla collapsing in a palace corridor after being told that her family had been cut off by the king played as a kind of justice. Not a cruel justice, and not a celebrated one, but a justice in the ancient sense of the word, the sense that means the wheel has turned and whatever was owed has been paid. These are the people who never forgave Camilla for Diana, who watched the decades of rehabilitation with a skeptical eye, who attended the coronation and clapped in the right places but carried, somewhere in a private room inside themselves, a door that stayed permanently locked on the subject of the woman who had become queen. For these people, there was a satisfaction in the image, involuntary, not celebrated aloud, but present. And then, actually, there were the people for whom that satisfaction felt uncomfortable the moment they noticed it. Because collapsing is collapsing. Because 70-something-year-old women don't fold to the floors of corridors because they're villains getting their due. They fold because they're human beings who have hit the limit of what a human being can hold. And whatever Camilla had done 30 years ago, whatever her culpability and whatever pain had been distributed among whichever people, she was in that corridor, simply a woman who had been told that the institution she had given her life to had decided her family was a problem it needed to solve. The third group, and this is always the group that is hardest to be in, the group that history tends to locate itself, were the people who held both things at once without resolving them, who could see the palace's logic and find it cold, who could see Camilla's pain and find it real, who could understand that an institution built on centuries of exactly this kind of decision, the cutting of inconvenient ties, the restructuring of relationships that have become liabilities, doesn't become something else simply because the person on the receiving end of the cut is someone you've watched age into a kind of dignified acceptance. The crown doesn't change its nature for love. It never has. That is both its strength and its most brutal quality. Inside, to be fair, the palace, the days that followed the collapse were managed with the precision that crisis always produces in institutions that have been managing crises since before nations were nations. Camilla was kept from public view. This was attributed, in the official language, to a period of rest following a minor health episode. The phrase minor health episode was used in 3 consecutive official communications. The repetition of it was its own kind of signal, a signal that the palace was aware the phrase wasn't being believed and was choosing to use it anyway because the alternative was saying something true, and saying something true wasn't currently an option. Charles maintained his schedule. He opened things. Honestly, plus he visited things. He stood in front of things and said the things that kings say when they stand in front of things. His face in photographs from those days was the face of a man carrying something behind his eyes that the photographs couldn't quite reach. He had spent his entire life learning to keep things behind his eyes. He was honestly very good at it. But the people who watched him closely, the royal correspondents who had been covering the Windsors for decades, who had developed the ability to read the particular body language of a family that communicated primarily through body language, because words were too risky, they noticed things. A stillness that was slightly different from his usual stillness. A pause before answering certain questions at a walkabout in Gloucester that lasted perhaps 1 second longer than pauses of that kind usually last. He was carrying it. He had made the decision he believed was necessary for the institution, and he was carrying the weight of what that decision had cost the woman he had chosen over everything. Over public approval, over his first marriage, over the comfortable and manageable life he could have had if he had simply let go of her when the palace first suggested it 30 years ago. He had not let go then. The question that the correspondents were asking each other, in the particular quiet way that questions like this get asked, in the hallways of press briefings, over coffees in the cafes near the palace gates, in the group chats that never get screenshotted, was whether this was different. Whether this particular decision, made in the name of the institution, was the thing that would finally put a crack in something that had improbably survived everything else. I mean, Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son, released no statement. His sister Laura released no statement. Plus, the Bowles family, in the face of what had effectively been a public announcement, however carefully worded, that they were no longer welcome in the inner circle of British royal life, said nothing. That silence was its own kind of dignity. Tom, to be fair, Parker Bowles is a food writer. He has a career, a life, a public presence that exists entirely separate from his mother's role as queen. He has always navigated the strangeness of his position with a lightness that suggests either exceptional emotional intelligence or exceptional compartmentalization, and perhaps both. He appears on television programs about food, and he talks about restaurants with genuine enthusiasm. He doesn't talk about his mother's position or the palace or the weight of what it means to be the son of a queen in a country that spent 3 decades hating your mother in public. He said nothing now. What the silence of the Bowles family communicated to those paying attention was that this wasn't a surprise. Not entirely. The restructuring, the word the palace had chosen, the word that meant cutting, may have been formal now, may have been made explicit in the way that things only become official when the institution decides to make them so. But the underlying reality of it, the sense that the crown would always eventually prioritize the crown over the people attached to it by love rather than by blood, wasn't news. They had always known this was possible. They had simply hoped, the way all families attached to great and cold institutions hope, that it would not be them, that they would be the exception, that the warmth they believed they had built, the goodwill they believed they had accumulated, would be enough to make them untouchable. Look, it wasn't enough. It never is. Camilla reappeared on the 12th day. She appeared at a garden reception, wearing blue, standing beside Charles with the particular posture of a woman who has made a decision about how she's going to present herself and has committed to it completely. I think she shook hands. She spoke to people. She smiled. Not with her full face, not the real smile that people who had seen it described as the thing that made you understand why Charles had never quite gotten over her, but a smile that was complete enough to be photographed and printed and used as evidence that everything was fine. She was, by every observable measure, fine. She was also, by every observable measure, not fine at all. The people who were close enough to see her eyes, and there are always people close enough at events like this because royals exist inside a permanent intimacy with strangers who study them the way scientists study specimens. Those people saw something that the cameras didn't quite capture. Something that was sitting just behind the composure. Something that didn't have a clean name. What it looked like to the people who saw it and tried to describe it later was grief. Not grief for a person. Not the acute, sharp-edged grief of loss. The slower kind. The kind for what it's worth that settles into the structure of a person and changes the way they hold themselves, the way they look at rooms they've stood in 100 times, the way they understand the ground beneath their feet. To be fair, the ground had shifted. She was standing on it anyway. That perhaps was the most Camilla thing about the whole situation. That she came back, which that she stood in the garden in blue and shook hands and smiled the 3/4 smile and let the cameras do what cameras do. She had survived 30 years of being the most hated woman in Britain. She was going to survive this too. But something had changed in the chemistry of her survival. Something that couldn't be unseen by anyone paying close enough attention. The crown had shown her, finally, and formally, where she stood in the hierarchy of things it would protect. She wasn't at the top. She had never been at the top. And, actually, now she knew it in a way that couldn't be unknowed. Here is what the palace understands about power that ordinary people spend their whole lives learning too late. Power is not loud. Power doesn't announce, itself in declarations or confrontations or dramatic scenes in corridors where guards step forward and women fold to the floor. That is the aftermath of power. Plus, that is what power leaves behind after it's already done its work quietly, in a meeting room, across a table, in precise and careful language that cannot be argued with because it doesn't raise its voice. Power is the decision that has already been made before you walk into the room. Camilla walked into that room, and the decision had already been made. The meeting was, a formality, a courtesy, even in the particular palace sense of the word courtesy, the sense that means you are being told something rather than consulted, but you're being told with care because the person telling you believes you deserve care, even as they deliver the news that rearranges your world. Charles had always given her that, at least. Even now, even in this. She walked out, and the corridor was very long. Here's the thing. In the weeks that followed her return to public duties, Camilla's schedule was, if anything, fuller than it had been before. This is the palace's most reliable strategy for managing narratives about the people inside it. Put them in front of things, let them be photographed doing things, let the accumulation of engagements and smiles and appropriate responses to the things people say at garden parties and Hospital openings create the impression of a life proceeding normally. It is a strategy that works because the public mostly wants to be reassured. They want to look at the Queen standing in a garden in blue and believe that everything is fine, because the alternative, believing that the people at the top of the oldest institution in the country are carrying wounds that don't show, requires a kind of sustained attention that ordinary life doesn't easily make room for. But there are people paying attention. There are always people paying attention. The royal correspondent's look had been waiting with the professional patience of people who have learned that royal stories don't resolve on a timeline that accommodates deadlines for the next movement in the story. The collapse TBH had been the first beat. The return had been the second beat. There would be a third. There's always a third. Plus, what they were watching for in the months after the garden reception, and the carefully managed appearances, and the three-quarter smiles with the small signs. Not the large gestures. The large gestures are managed too completely to read anything into them. The small ones. The way a hand rests differently on a husband's arm than it used to. The way a response to a question at a walkabout is slightly shorter than it might have been before, the energy in it calibrated just a degree lower. The way two people who have been photographed together for 20 years can stand together for photographs and reveal, in the geometry of their bodies, things they've no intention of revealing. What the correspondent saw in those months wasn't a rupture. It was something quieter than a rupture. Something more durable than a rupture. Actually, distance. Not the dramatic distance of a couple in crisis. Not the visible cold space that the cameras had once captured between Charles and Diana in their worst years. Nothing so legible as that. Something subtler. Plus, something that looked, to anyone who wasn't looking closely, like the normal, composed distance of two people who have been photographed standing next to each other for long enough that they no longer need to arrange themselves for it. But to the look, people who had been watching them for years, it was different. Just different enough, and the hand that rested on the arm rested with a weight that was doing something slightly different than it used to do. The way she turned toward him at public events, the particular angle of that turning, the degree of it, was fractionally less complete than it had been before. The small physical grammar of their relationship, the grammar that had been building for 30 years and that told to those who knew how to read it. The story of two people who had chosen each other at significant cost and never fully regretted the cost. That grammar had a new sentence in it. A sentence that said, "I know now what the cost is measured against." The Bowles family had, in the aftermath of the formal distancing, become a subject of significant media attention. This is the other thing that palace decisions of this kind inevitably produce. They create a story around the people who have been pushed to the periphery, a story that is told by every outlet that had previously ignored them completely. Tom Parker Bowles gave an interview in this period, not about his mother, not about the palace or the decision or any of the things that everyone wanted him to talk about. He gave an interview about a book he had written about food, about the particular pleasures of eating well and the culture of sitting down together at a table, about the way that food is always really about something else, about love, about family, about the things that hold people together when other things that try to pull them apart. It was on the surface an interview about food. It wasn't really an interview about food, which the interviewer, who was good at her job, asked him at the end, gently, with the care of someone who knows they're touching something that could break, how he was finding things. Generally. Just generally. Tom Parker Bowles paused. Plus, he looked well at the space just past the interviewer's shoulder for a moment. He said his mother was a remarkable woman. He said she had always been a remarkable woman. He said that remarkable women know how to navigate things that would floor most people, and that he had enormous faith in her ability to do that. He didn't say anything else, and he didn't need to. The interviewer moved on. The thing is, what no one had yet fully examined, in all the coverage and all the analysis and all the sourced and unsourced reporting that had accumulated around the story like sediment, was the question of what this had cost Charles. The question of Camilla's pain was visible, and she had collapsed. She had been seen. The collapse was its own kind of testimony. But Charles's grief, If grief is the right word for what a king feels when he makes a decision that he believes is necessary and correct, and that also breaks the person he loves in a corridor 40 feet from where he made the decision, wasn't visible in the same way. It couldn't be. He was the king. Plus, the king doesn't collapse in corridors. The king doesn't reveal, in any observable way, the interior cost of the decisions he makes in his role as king. That is part of the contract. That kind of has always been part of the contract. Elizabeth II understood it completely and held to it so rigorously that even in the worst years, the Windsor Castle fire, the death of Diana, the years when the public turned against the family with a ferocity that no previous generation of Windsors had faced, her face had remained the face of composed authority. Charles had grown up watching that. He had spent his entire life in the shadow of that composure, measuring himself against it, finding himself lacking, trying again. He had been the complicated one, the feeling one, the one who talked to plants and believed in things that made people uncomfortable and cried at funerals in ways that the tabloids had, in earlier years, made fun of. He had never quite achieved his mother's seal, but he was trying now. The photographs, from those months showed a man trying. His face was the face of composed authority. His shoulders were the shoulders of composed authority. He did the things that kings do, and he said the things that kings say, and he stood in the photographs with the woman he had chosen over everything, and he was present in all the required ways. What was behind his eyes was his. Some things, even now, remained his, which is cool. The story shifted in the way that long-running stories always eventually shift, not through a dramatic new development, but through the accumulation of smaller movements that gradually change the shape of what is understood. Information continued to emerge about the specific conduct that had triggered Charles's decision regarding the Bowles family. The information was never complete. There are whole chapters of this story that are in rooms that no journalist or correspondent has yet reached, and perhaps never will. The palace manages its secrets with a thoroughness that is itself a form of power. But what emerged was enough to suggest that the situation had been more serious than the word restructuring had initially implied. There had been actions that had, in the judgment of the people whose job it is to judge these things on behalf of the crown, created a genuine exposure, not a tabloid gossip exposure. The palace has long since made its peace with that variety of exposure and developed strategies for managing it. A deeper exposure, the kind that touches the credibility of the institution itself. Charles had been advised, in clear terms, that allowing the situation to continue unaddressed wasn't an option that the crown could afford. He had heard the advice. He had weighed it against everything else, against 20 years of Camilla's patience, against the 30 years before that, against the knowledge of what the decision would cost her when she was told, and he had made the choice that kings make. The institution first. Always, in the end, the institution first. The British monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years, not because the people inside it are always good or wise or kind or right. It has survived because the people inside it, at the moments that matter most, have been willing to sacrifice the personal for the institutional, have been willing to cut the thing that needed to be cut, close the door that needed to be closed, stand in the corridor, and be the person who told someone they love that love, in this context, had a ceiling. Charles knew this. Camilla knew this too, probably, had always known it, on the level where you know things you'd prefer not to know. She had spent 30 years learning the rules of the institution she was marrying into. She had been careful and patient and strategically brilliant in the way she had allowed herself to be absorbed into it, never pushing, never demanding, always letting the palace set the pace of her acceptance. She knew the rules. Knowing, I think, them and living through their application are two entirely different things. 6 months after the collapse, Camilla attended a charity event in London, one connected to a cause she had supported for years, one she had personally championed through the harder years when her public standing made championing anything a complicated act. She stood at the front of the room and she spoke. She spoke well. She's always spoken well, with a directness and a dry warmth that people who expect stiffness from royals find disarming. She, well, said the things that the event required, and she said them in a way that made the people in the room feel, genuinely, that she meant them. At the end of the event, a woman approached her. Not a reporter, not a dignitary, just one of the attendees, a woman perhaps 10 years, younger than Camilla, who had worked with the charity for years. The woman said, in the direct and slightly reckless way that ordinary people sometimes speak to royals when they forget to be intimidated, that she had been following recent events and that she just wanted to say that she admired how Camilla had handled things. Camilla looked at the woman for a moment. She said, "One handles what one must." It wasn't a quote designed for publication. It was the honest answer of a woman who had learned, across a life that had been more turbulent than she had expected and more shaped by forces outside her control than most people's lives, that endurance is not the same as victory and is not the same as defeat. It is its own thing. She had endured. She was enduring still. The marriage was intact, and the public duties continued. The photographs showed two people standing together. The ground beneath them had shifted, and they were standing on it anyway, which is either a testament to love's tenacity or to the weight of the institution that holds them both, or most likely to the complicated and unresolvable truth that sometimes those two things are the same thing. The question that this story doesn't answer, cannot answer, because no story about living people can answer it while they're still living it, is what happens next. Whether the distance visible in the small physical grammar of their public appearances resolves itself, or stays, or deepens. Whether Camilla's, relationship with her children and her family on the other side of the palace wall shifts in ways that change something fundamental about who she's when she's not being the queen. Whether Charles, in the private rooms, in the moments that cameras don't reach, carries the weight of his decision the way men who have done necessary. Painful things carry them, or the way men who have done necessary and painful things and aren't sure they were right carry them. Whether the crown, which is always the crown, which has been the crown since before any of the individuals inside it were born and will be the crown long after all of them are gone, notices any of this at all. It doesn't, of course. That is the point of it. That is the terrible and majestic thing about institutions built to outlast human feeling. They aren't built to notice. They are built to continue. And so they continue. And people inside them continue to, carrying what they carry, standing on ground that shifts without warning, smiling the three-quarter smile at garden parties in blue. The crown survives. It always does. The only question with any royal story is what it costs the people inside it. This one, like all the others, cost exactly as much as it took. Not more, not less. Exactly as much as it took. And the woman who had survived being the most hated woman in Britain, who had waited 3 decades for a love that the whole world told her she didn't deserve, who had stood in a garden in blue 12 days after folding to the floor of a palace corridor and smiled the smile that said everything is fine. That woman was still standing. Diminished, maybe, changed in some for what it's worth, way that had not yet fully revealed its shape. Knowing things now that she would have preferred not to know, but standing, that for Camilla Parker Bowles, who had never once in 30 years stopped standing, was both the least remarkable thing about her and the most remarkable thing about her. Both things at once. Unresolved, the way the truest things always are.